think about that. Government has nothing to give anybody except what it first takes from somebody. It doesn't get it from Christmas trees. It doesn't sell cookies like the Girl Scouts do. It has nothing to give anybody except what it first takes from somebody. And a government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you've got. There's a trade-off. There's a little story from a man named Tom Anderson from Tennessee that I think really illustrates this well. It goes back some years, and as he told it, there was a band of wild hogs along a bend of a river in Georgia somewhere. And this band of wild hogs was a stubborn, ornery, independent, self-reliant bunch. They had survived floods and freezes and fires and droughts and hunters and dogs and you name it. Nobody thought that these wild hogs could ever be captured. And one day a stranger came into town not far from where the hogs were. He went into the general store and he said, "Tell me where I can find the hogs. I have a plan to pen them up." And the storekeeper laughed at him, and he nonetheless said, "Well, they're in this direction," and off the stranger then went with nothing but a few sacks of corn, an axe, and a one-horse wagon. And he came back into town a few months later, went into the store, and he said to the storekeeper, "Well, I've got them all penned up in the swamp. I need some help to bring the hogs out." And the storekeeper couldn't believe it, and others came from miles around to hear the story of how this man had penned the hogs that everybody assumed could never be captured. The stranger said, "Well, it was really rather simple. At first, I made a clearing at the center of the forest with my axe, and then I put some of the corn at the center of the clearing. And for the first few days, none of the hogs would come out and take any of it, but after a while, some of the younger ones came, grabbed some of the corn and scampered back into the underbrush, and before long, the older ones were coming and taking the corn too, each of them figuring that if they didn't get their share, another one would get it in his place. And before long, he said they were all taking the corn regularly as I put it in the clearing. And he said it was about that time that I began to build a fence around the clearing, a little higher each day. And at the right place," he said, "I built a trap door, and at the right moment, I sprung it." And his last line was, "Naturally, they squealed and hollered when they knew I had them. But I can pen any animal on the face of this earth if I can first get him to depend on me for a free handout." When I first heard that story, Mr. Anderson paused at that point, and then he said, "Fellow hogs, we've been fenced." Well, some people, I've had audiences where they think, "Oh, he's being rabidly anti-government." And I'm saying, wait a minute, this is no more radical than the views of America's founders. It was George Washington who said, "Government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. And like fire," he said, "it can be either a dangerous servant or a fearful master." This is George Washington, father of our country. Government is not reason, it's not eloquence, it's force. And like fire, it can be either a dangerous servant or a fearful master. What he's saying there is, even if government is no bigger than he wanted it to be, and even if it did those things in the most efficient manner possible, even if it was the servant of the people it's intended to be, it's still what? Dangerous. You have to keep your eye on it. You can't just wind it up and walk away and expect somebody else to take care of it for you. As Franklin said, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, not momentary glances in Washington's direction or wherever. You have to keep an eye on it. You have to fulfill the duties of a responsible citizen if you expect your liberties to be secure. You can't be lining up at the trough and expect your liberties to be secure. Well, the final principle is, I should point out too, by the way, if you ever want to know more about an American president who really stood steadfast for these virtues, I mean, certainly in our lifetime, Ronald Reagan is a great example. One of my favorites is Grover Cleveland. And I always want to put a word in for poor Grover because he's long been forgotten, but he vetoed more bills than all the previous 21 presidents combined. And in one of his vetoes, which was of a Texas seed bill that would have given drought-stricken farmers in Texas $10,000 federal dollars, he vetoed it and he said, "Though the people may support the government, it is not the duty of the government to support the people. And we have to rely upon the charity of our fellow countrymen in times of distress, lest we travel the path of bankruptcy and dictatorship." Prophetic, and he was a Democrat. barely 100 years ago. Final principle is liberty makes all the difference in the world. Liberty makes all the difference in the world. Liberty was not too long ago in American life. It was that principle that when it was invoked on the floor of the Congress, it was powerful enough to defeat many a measure. Merely standing up and saying this proposal is a bad one because it would do violence to the people's liberties carried a great deal of weight. Today, unfortunately, that isn't the case. Too often, all you have to argue is, well, this will help this group, and it's enough to get everybody's vote. And liberty is rarely invoked. But liberty makes all the difference in the world. In fact, think about it. How worthwhile would life be without it? It makes life worth living. Without it, few things are possible. That's how important it is. And it doesn't just happen. It isn't automatic. It isn't guaranteed. Liberty isn't something that we must assume we'll always have just because we've had it before. In fact, the numbers of people who have walked this earth who have enjoyed liberty is a tiny fraction of all the people who've ever lived. Freedom is the peculiar institution in the history of humanity. Slavery, in one form or another, is far more common. Liberty requires diligence, dedication, it requires education, it requires sacrifice, it requires passing on its virtues from one generation to another. It means being an adult steward of our liberties by sharing these values with our children. Liberty requires a lot of effort, a lot of thought, a lot of sacrifice and support. That's why I'm so excited about the growth of free market think tanks like Show Me, who will be educating people in your state and beyond on some of these important principles. But sometimes I'm reminded of the importance of liberty when I learn of someone from another country where they haven't had it and who, who seems to appreciate it so much more deeply than most Americans. So I'll close with a story that a few people heard last night if you were at the discussion club. Hope you don't mind hearing it a second time. I think of it anytime I'm ever tempted to be down or discouraged. It's a great message of optimism. It reminds me of how important liberty is. This goes back to 1986 when I made a visit to Poland, still governed by the communist regime at that point. This is 3 years before the big changes that ended the evil empire. And I spent 2 weeks with people who were active in the anti-communist, pro-liberty underground within Poland. And it was a fascinating experience, meeting with underground printers who were illegally printing great works of literature and distributing it throughout Poland. And at one point I asked one of the printers, where do you get the paper for all this stuff? And he said, we get it from two places. We smuggle it in from the West and we steal it from communists. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, the communist government has its factories where they make their newspapers and books and what have you, but the workers think like we do there. They're getting the government's paper out and into our hands. And sometimes when the coast is really clear, they print our stuff on the government's printing presses. But one evening, my escort said, we want you to meet this very special couple, Zbigniew and Sofia Romaszewski. And I had never heard of them before, but I was really in for a treat. They ran underground radio for Solidarity during the first 6 months of martial law, back December of '81 to mid-'82. You recall those days? There were rumors before martial law, before the crackdown, that there would be a Warsaw Pact invasion of Poland. We now know that John Paul II sent word that if the Soviets invaded, he would be in Poland leading the cause against them. It was a rather frightening time with all the rumors swirling of an impending Soviet invasion. That didn't happen, but the communist government, at the behest of their Soviet overlords, did declare martial law, and they jailed thousands of people and brought out the water cannons to break up the protests, and Poland descended into several years of darkness. And I was there in the midst of that in '86, trying to find out, well, what are people thinking? Are they taking this lying down, or are they doing something to try to free their country? And they were incredibly active on behalf of liberating their country, and they would see the fruits of that just 3 years later. But one night, my escort said, we want you to meet Zbigniew and Sofia Romaszewski. And so while I was there, I asked them many questions about underground radio. What was it like to broadcast before you were found and arrested? He was given, by the way, 4 years in jail. She was given 3. They were kept in solitary confinement apart from each other for much of that time. They weren't out of prison all that long when I was there in their apartment in November of '86. They were eager to impress upon me how they were active again. Liberty meant everything to them, and they didn't care that the police could beat down their door at 3 in the morning and haul them off to jail again, because liberty was that important to them. I could have said, and I think I did in some fashion, that you're up against the Army, Navy, and Air Force of the Soviet Empire. How can you hope to prevail? That didn't make any difference to them. They knew they were on the right side, and they were working for the right. And at one point I asked, how did you know if people were listening when you were broadcasting? How did you know if they were listening? And Sophia answered and said, well, we wondered that ourselves. We could only broadcast 8 or 10 minutes at a time. Then we had to go off the air to avoid being traced and detected. But one evening we said to people on the air, if you believe in liberty for Poland and in the message of this radio, please blink your lights and call your friends who you believe to think the same way and ask them to do the same. And she said, we then went to the window, and for hours, all of Warsaw was blinking. In the spring of '89, when General Jaruzelski had his electrifying news conference and told the world that Poland was going to have its first free elections since Soviet domination. You recall that? First big crack in the Eastern European Empire of the Soviet Union. He said the reason Poland had to do that was that it had become ungovernable. And I knew exactly what he meant, because I was thinking of people like the Romaszewskis, who didn't just sit back and figure that the lack of freedom was their destiny. They believed in it strongly enough. They persevered, they fought hard, and they prevailed, and a continent today is free because of the efforts of people like them and those in the West like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and John Paul II who supported them. Liberty makes all the difference in the world, and let it never be forgotten as we shape public policy, whatever the issue, wherever the state capital, and in Washington as well. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being so attentive. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. I know I've gone a little long, so I'll try to make my answers brief, but if there are any, I'll be happy to take a few questions. If you have to leave, I understand. We are pushing the time limit, so I will not be offended. Yes, sir.
I'm a state representative in Jefferson City, and I've been watching, I do economic development, try to help. I've been watching Ireland.
Yes.
Their tax policy and intellectual property, and the fact that our Fortune 100, 500 companies are taken overseas. What is it that Missouri can do, and the states can do, to protect intellectual property and follow their model on tax policy from a country that was going hungry with potato famine? Now they're probably one of the dominant political forces in the world.
Yeah, great question. It concerns Ireland, which at the moment has twice the growth rate of the rest of Europe, and it's directly traceable to a policy of dramatic tax reductions, reductions in government spending, and making their entrepreneurial climate more friendly, their business climate more friendly to entrepreneurship and new businesses. It is the booming spot in Europe, the only one that's really booming. Well, let me just say, in tax policy at least, I think they're leading the way. And what their policy is telling us is that people are creatures of incentive. You reduce the burdens on enterprise, you get more enterprise. So I would say, as a state legislator, it would be paramount in your duties to find ways to reduce the size and spending and intrusiveness of state government and pass those savings on to people. Don't look for new programs to squander the savings on. But look, unfortunately, in my state of Michigan, we've done some of that. Make state government lean, mean, efficient, focused on the core fundamentals. The best economic development policy is basically get out of the way. Well, I know we've gone late. Let me again thank you for being such a great audience. And I want to thank Ethel May, too, because she has really worked me good the last couple of days. And I've had some great audiences. Thank you.